Nowadays, it's changed where I want to be starting with the melodic content first. I want to be starting with some sort of hook, some sort of melody that really draws me in. And then from there, the chords and the textures and the pads. And then going back and working more, focusing more on the drum beat, more on the percussion. It's like my history is kind of more as a percussionist, you know, so it starts there. But I'm seeing that if a song is beautiful and has a hook and has a vibe without the drums, then it's strong. Then that can dictate, that rhythm of the melody can dictate the drums that you produce. And anytime there's a break or an intro with just that melody, this listener's already pulled in, and there's such a beauty to that. So it's kind of a newer thing that I'm trying to work with. I still get sucked into just making a dope beat, and but I want both to be strong without the other. I want to beat with enough melody to the percussion that you can take away all the melody elements, and there's still this hook to it.
You're listening to the Freio Music Podcast.
To the Freio Music
Podcast.
My name is Scott Howard, and I go by Scott Nice. I've been living in Nevada City, California, which is in the Sierra foothills, like near Lake Tahoe.
Nice. And where were you born, out of curiosity?
I was born in rural Oregon, but a lot of my formative years were in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York.
Nice. So you got both coasts.
Yeah, so I got nature vibes, and then I got like more of the privileged suburban opportunities that, you know, gave me a lot of boosts in high school.
What started getting you into art? I know that you're a skater, so maybe it starts with skating, but what started getting you into art?
I was drawing, I started drawing when I was like 5 years old maybe, and I used to draw a lot of comic book characters. I drew a lot of Mad Magazine kind of things and political cartoons when I was really young, and then found skateboarding when I was about 10, and then snowboarding when I was 12. And so I was always drawing and skating, and just kind of a mix between the two pretty much, you know, up until like later in high school when I found DJing and was just always super into music, mostly a lot into hip hop, either like oldies, like super old vibes, or like East Coast hip hop. That was kind of my musical background when I was in high school.
Oh, that's good. So when you started out on skating and snowboarding, were you taking it real seriously? Were you pushing yourself to learn new tricks, or were you just kind of taking it casually?
Yeah, me and my friends were always pushing each other. Always trying to find the next level of a trick or a style, or, you know, always pushing each other. So yeah, so it was like our whole life. We'd skateboard every single day. And and then when it came to snowboarding, it was a little more difficult to do it every day per se until later. But it was a similar thing. It was like the same exact thing. It was just how can you do something more, find a different thing, a different way to use an object, a different way to do a trick, you know, like it was all about style.
So tell me about that style and how you were able to get your foot in the door into that skating and shoe and style, you know, industry. What was it that kind of evolved in your style, or what made you recognize that was a path for you at that time?
Well, usually a lot of people work in the action sports industry because they realize that they're not good enough to be pro or professional. So they end up finding other pathways in. But I was already, even though I was working at, ski resorts and trying to pursue that world, I was always at night teaching myself Photoshop, teaching myself photography, just totally enamored, staying up all night, just in this passion of this new level of art, which was for me at the time, which was like the digital level. I didn't even know what design was at the time. No one in my high school taught me about it, which is just like so ridiculous. But yeah, so by the time I fractured my neck snowboarding, I fractured my thumb, I broke a rib. So I had 2 seasons in a row, I had a couple pretty big collisions or pretty big injuries. So that pushed me even more towards focusing on how I can create and do something in this world. And eventually that led me to finding an internship and working at a snowboard magazine. And that's when the real feet to the fire started. It's funny. It's almost like you always have to put yourself in over your head to really learn. And that first internship, it was like, man, the art director thought I was like a real illustrator and had me do some stuff. And then he looked at my work and was just like, okay, we're not going to have you do any drawing because you suck. You know what I mean? It was like that, jumping into that level where it's not okay to be yourself. And so for many years, I had to be perfect. I had to learn what I didn't go to school for, learn what people, were getting paid a lot of money to do, and learn really quickly. And the digital world is one of those worlds where you can hide behind your computer and do something until it's perfect, versus like the acoustic musician world or like the hand-drawn world where there's like a more of a raw vulnerability. So it's taken me many years since then to see those what end up becoming barriers, this like kind of needing to be perfect, mentality that exists in the professional world, exists when you're working in editorial worlds. So undoing some of that these days.
Tell me about that. When did you start realizing that those maybe minor imperfections are actually what make something stand out or change up the feel? When something's a little offbeat, maybe it has a different feel than if it were perfectly on the grid, So what were some of the key connections that you were developing, the skill sets that you were learning with the magazine and working on that front that helped transition you into the music world, other than like Photoshop you mentioned?
I think there's a sense of balance and like negative space that you find in the design world that's very similar in the musical world. A lot of what I learned and a lot of how professional industries work is based on references. It's based on having like a high aspiration and a high goal. And a lot of it is referential. A lot of it is seeing, like, especially like if you look at the fashion world or how it used to be, the fashion world used to come out with something and then a couple years later it would trickle down to like maybe action sports, and then a couple years later it trickle down to like mainstream. Now the way things are so quick, it's like Target's knocking off a fashion design that's happening in high fashion like within a year, So, but similarly, like in the design world, art directors would just have a lot of references. They would have books of styles, and they would hit the bullseye in that sense. And so I think musically, that's a lot of how I work too. It's kind of the style of the mashup, where it's like, oh, I hear this this certain synth sound that's like in pop music, but then I hear this like kind of more indigenous sounding like drum pattern. And what would those two sound together? Has that happened? Have those two styles been put together? And so there's a referential aspect, and then there's a creating something new through those references. And so, yeah, that's something that I haven't heard anyone else talk about, but when I work with music, a lot of times it's from like an art director's point of view, you know? It's like an art director has a Pinterest board and they have all these different moods and these different styles when they're working for a client. And similarly, it's like, yeah, I'll be listening to certain variety of music and get inspired by different things I'm hearing.
In your mind, do they all coalesce into the song, like the various parts that you hear? So maybe you hear, you know, that are you able to blend them all, or what ends up maybe not making the cut, or do you kind of have a very clear direction from the outset as to the sounds that will and will not fit?
Yeah, it's always an experiment, and sometimes it like works out perfectly, and sometimes you end up cycling through that idea to another idea, and you know, going through a whole roundabout way to finally come to your final product. So I just never know, and I guess that's kind of the fun and excitement about it is that it's always an experiment, and certain parts might work and certain parts might turn into other new songs, you know?
Yeah. And how do you save and recycle those ideas? If maybe you think that's a cool piece, but it just doesn't fit in this track, you know, how do you organize and think through labeling, or however you work with your files? Yeah,
that's funny. I was just having this conversation. I just ran into, there's so many dope local producers here. I just ran into Equanimous and Ruby Chase and another Volo and another producer to who's like one of my favorites. I ran into them all yesterday at lunch, and we were all having this conversation about, you know, our files, our archive of files that are like starts and like ideas for songs. And one of the things that I was sharing is that there's almost like two phases happening, where there's the start phase where I let myself work on a track, and if there's an idea, just open up a new file and start to develop a whole new idea separately. And just the more you start on new things, the more likely you're gonna find the thing with the most potential to go off with. Like my first album, I would have a certain idea and I would tunnel vision, and I would just spend like a month and a half just like on one song, and it wasn't that enjoyable, and I don't even think the result was as strong. Rather, if I had started a song and then let go of some attachment and let myself start another, and then let yourself start another, until you really are clear on like what you're most stoked on. And then the energy for those just naturally builds them up. And then you go into a finishing phase. And the finishing phase is where you're like, okay, now I've got to put this into like a final composition. I got to work on mixing. I got to see like what it's still lacking. And that's where it's been really helpful to let myself start new things. Cause you could spend so much time on a track that you end up not even being that excited about. Or you could spend 15 minutes on something totally different and just be more excited than you've ever been. You know what I mean? So I've been learning the less attached, and like the less attached I can be to a song, the better the outcome. You know, the more I can just let go of 40 hours of work and start something else. And the quicker I let go of the work that I've done, not needing to like, you know, turn that into something good, or the better off I am.
Yeah, it's just the joy of starting again with a blank canvas, and getting everything is open. You know, no longer are you trying to fit this tiny sound into that little place in that tiny section of the song. You know, you're now have the creative reins back in your control. So when you open a new project and it's starting from scratch, what are some of the first go-to plugins or VSTs, if you use any, or layers that are maybe typical go-tos, like drum beat first or melody first? How do you approach a new Ableton project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been working with that a lot lately. In the past, it was always the like tribal percussion that always inspired me, all the hand drum kind of rhythms. That was the foundation of like every track, and that I would typically try to start with. And especially like in my earlier stuff, I was always trying to have a less traditional either four to the floor or boom bap kind of beat. I was always trying to find something that was different. Nowadays, I've kind of figured out the wisdom of the simplicity of those beat styles. When from years of feeling people's movement on the dance floor, it's like, oh, okay, that's why we have an overriding kick and snare in that way, and so I'm a little less experimental in that way. But what I've realized is that I need to be starting, nowadays it's changed where I want to be starting with the melodic content first. I want to be starting with some sort of hook, some sort of melody that really draws me in. And then from there, the chords and the textures and the pads. And then going back and working more, focusing more on the drum beat, more on the percussion. It's like, my history is kind of more as a percussionist, so it starts there, but I'm seeing that if a song is beautiful and has a hook and has a vibe without the drums, then it's strong. Then that can dictate, that rhythm of the melody can dictate the drums that you produce. And anytime there's a break or an intro with just that melody, this listener's already pulled in, and there's such a beauty to that. So it's kind of a newer thing that I'm trying to work with. I still get sucked into just making a dope beat, but I want both to be strong without the other. I want to beat with enough melody to the percussion that you can take away all the melody elements, and there's still this hook to it. You know what I mean? And that's a lot of hand drums have like a timbre to them. They have a tone to them. So that already brings in some melody just with the variations of hand drums. But yeah, it's a new direction for me.
I like that. And I like that strategy of removing the drums just to see if everything else is driving forward. And if you feel that rhythm still coming through, then you've got something. And then you do the inverse. You go on the other side and you mute the melody and make sure that the drum is, actually, getting you moving and building that energy as you said. So that's a cool approach. I haven't heard somebody describe it in that way.
It's similar with remixes. Like when you have a remix and you have like a strong chord progression and a nice vocal, it's really easy to just produce around that and kind of lean on that to carry the song. And some producers do that. They keep like a really simple thing going on and they're producing around the vocal. And honestly, that's a quick way to have a nice song and, move on to the next project. But I usually want to have the song be strong without that chord progression or without that vocal. So I'll make sure that there's agreement between the vocal and the chord progression, but then I'll take it away and just try to build up the track without relying on those things. Chord progressions are another one of those things. People can have, 4 chords playing and it's a song, right? And it can kind of be a crutch. It can kind of like prevent you from creating other stronger parts because you're really relying on that one foundation. So chord progressions are another thing that's good to just mute it and then try to develop something without the chords that sounds really beautiful. And then when you bring the chords back in, it's like glorious.
Yeah, that's great. If it all aligns when you bring it back in.
Exactly.
So, yeah. One of your songs, Avecitos, I'd like to explore a little bit more in depth. First of all, it has a really strong flute and a guitar intro, and then very melodic and like a percussive vocal, and I found that to be very interesting. So I'm curious how you approach that song and some of the backstory behind it. So what was it that drove you to create it?
It kind of opens up a few other subjects. So the background that I've had with my own healing path has been a lot around ritual and chanting, in a sober kind of environment. And when I moved up to Northern California, I happened to be around a lot of people doing ritual, but more with the plant medicine direction. And I was just I'm naturally attracted to, let's say, more traditional practices and prayer practices. And so even though I wasn't deep in the ayahuasca world, I was just running into beautiful people in the community who were holding ceremony and singing these songs. And so that was how I ran into this woman, Shira, who just was in the dance community. And we were probably hanging out on the street after a dance sometime. And she was probably talking to me about how she sings and gave me a little snippet, probably live. And I was like, let's make a song. And it's funny because I think the original loop that I was working with to even create that was just like a voice recording that she texted me, and I built the whole song around that. But yeah, I mean, the biggest part of the backstory really is that I wanted to create this kind of ritual healing vibe. It's interesting that it's connected. It's been the most, up until recently, it was my most popular song, and it's connected with a lot of people who are in that world, who are in more of the actual like plant medicine world. But that wasn't the original intention, wasn't to be specifically just in that world. It was like, all prayer, all healing was the intention. And what you said, percussive, it's like a staccato. Staccato, I think, is the term that they would use. A
better term, yeah, for sure.
And there's something about it that I love. Sometimes there's certain vocalists I work with that more have just like a pad sound. They stay in these long vowels. And I love how staccato breaks things up, even in hip hop, especially in hip hop. I love when they hit these like little double time staccato rhythms, and you can find that melody and rhythm even in that form of lyricism. Yeah, so that was probably part of it that attracted me to her voice and to the song she was singing.
Yeah, and it definitely has what I wrote down as like an Aboriginal feel, and there's a deep synth that reminds me of a didgeridoo. I don't think it is, but there's something going on. Like, tell me about that.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, usually when I think about, when people message me and tell me how they've been listening to that song and, crying to it and having these things, I'm always imagining like, oh, it's, Shira, her voice and her melody. But then I remember like, oh yeah, there's those sections where there's a departure. And that's something that like I try to have in every song. And it's totally bites me in the ass sometimes, because I want to go somewhere new. I want to see if we can create juxtaposition. I want to see if we can create a complement between emotions. And so there's this very high, beautiful, and then we go into a new space. And like naturally it's go down because it's like in the hara, it's like in the belly, it's like that deep, like you're saying, that kind of deep didge sound that kind of comes in. And it affects our movement, it affects our emotions. And that was an early example of me wanting to have that diversity, wanting to have that departure, to go somewhere new. It's a journey, right? So when a song's like chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, and that's it, it's very predictable. And I guess in that song, it's like a bridge. It really is a bridge. It's just one part where it comes in and we go somewhere new.
When you're thinking through those departure moments, do you have certain constraints that you keep consistent, like maybe the tempo or the key, or is everything open to change? How far are you departing,
No, really the departure is only the vibe. I mean, the tempo and the key, and I I look forward to the day when I'm like, doing more key changes and fancy things such as that. But it's mainly stripping things down. Like in this example, it's like stripping things down. So, and just changing the tonality of the sounds, just new sounds. But
and how do you change that tonality?
Well, in this example, it's like we're going to such a high, beautiful, like arpeggiated piano, like all these things. And then how can we go to like a deeper place? And overall, it's kind of darker sounds. The darker sounds complement the lighter sounds. And so that's usually an inspiration when I'm looking through sounds and trying to find a vibe. And there's also like a lot going on and very little going on. That minimalism versus maximalism. That's also part of the departure. And it tends to sink people back more into themselves. There's less of a chord progression. Again, how I mentioned chord progression, I don't even think there's really as much of a chord progression in that part. And again, the chord progression is very heart opening and kind of brings us more extroverted. It does kind of the work for us. And when that's gone, we go back more internal. And it's similar like when choreographing, like a DJ set, it's very similar, like knowing the things that are more minimal and the things that are more maximal and how that's going to shift the direction of people's energy at different stages in the journey or in the dance.
What are some of the key elements that you always want to have in maybe a given track or a given set?
Well, for a track, like I said before, one of the things that I've always kept as a pillar to like define the music that I'm making with this project is the hand drums, is the percussion, is giving you that that sense of history, of ancestry, and indigenosity, and I think, it's funny, the flute ended up being kind of like a hallmark of so many songs. And I'm sometimes curious. I'm like, I wonder if I have more flute per song than most other people.
That would be a funny ratio.
In the bass
like
music
in the Spotify stats,
Totally.
How much cowbell per art,
Exactly.
Right.
So again, though, it's one of those primal instruments, it's like, it's so old. I mean, my friend Evan from Dirtwire was telling me about the jaw harp and how there's a jaw harp in like every culture, which blew me away. And he knew the name. He knows the name for like the different name for jaw harp in all these different cultures. He must own like 30 years or more jaw harp. So that's another example. It's not my instrument per se, but it's another example of just finding that kind of primal sound that can also, be really funky. In a DJ set, it's funny, I was just having this conversation with another artist, Mose, and we were talking about, we were having a little bit of a debate around vocals, like in like an ecstatic dance journey or more of a dance set. Usually I like to, or even in 5 rhythms, that style of philosophy, it's good to start going inward and to have stuff with less chord progressions and, obviously a little slower tempo that's just not intimidating to move to. But then also with vocals, I feel like the longer you hold off in a set from having vocals, the more it draws people inwards. And a lot of times I think vocals can draw people more outward. And if you do it at the right time in the set or the right time in the song, it's more impactful. And so going back to a song, it's another reason that most songs I want to have, if it has vocals, I want it to be 50% instrumental and then 50% vocal to have that balance. I'm trying to think, I'm not sure if Aviciidos quite has that balance, but those departures and those instrumental places are very conscious because I want to have a break for the nervous system. I want to have this spaciousness that's not carried by the vocal.
It's interesting that you think about the internal perception of those listening and how it would draw people inward, as you were saying, and how the track is really an experience external to you that is not being perceived by you, but you're still trying to think through that journey and design for it, which is, obviously an art form. And I like the placement of the vocals, and I can certainly agree that vocals definitely, you're connected to it, especially if you understand the language. So that sometimes I enjoy listening to vocals where I don't understand the language, and then it's just the sound and the meaning and what I think that, then I get to paint my own picture of what they're saying. And it's just a different approach, but it certainly brings you into the, out external world as you listen to vocals. I agree with that.
Yeah,
observation.
And that's a purposeful thing. A lot of vocalists approach me, English singing vocalists, and I'll just let them know that I don't really record with that much English, and it's on purpose, because when I was studying tantric puja and Sanskrit during my healing days, there was a certain wisdom, and our teacher would say, like, don't worry about the meaning, just be with the intention and chant, and let the logical mind become a stenographer for the dream mind, for the intuitive mind, for the feminine mind. The feminine mind, the intuitive mind doesn't need to know logically what the translation is. And so that, just from the years of chanting and being deep in that practice, it's just extended through my music project, and it's just become like a core part, is that I prefer to record world prayers, Turkish, Hebrew, Spanish, Shipibo. It's that desire to be transported into a mystical space, into like a sacred space beyond, the human language.
There was a song that you did with Evan, and Highland Step, I think, is the one. I think there is a bunch of jaw harp and didge going on. Is there anything that you care to share about that song in particular?
I don't know, just that Evan was super easy to work with. I just sent him the track, and he came back with this like 3-minute long, and then I was just cutting up his jaw harp. And that guy is such an amazing musician. I don't know if you've seen Dirtwire play.
Yes, I have.
But he's just like, he's the most humble, sweetest dude. And he's so good at like every instrument. He can play.
It's crazy how many instruments that they play in one set.
Yeah, he can figure it out. I mean, he's just like that virtuoso. He understands music from an acoustic standpoint, and it's really mostly just. It reminds me of how much that guy inspires me.
When you're working on your songs, what instruments are you incorporating into the process? Like, I like to ask artists, what's your X factor? You could answer that too.
Well, for my live sets, my X factor is definitely more obvious, because it's turntablism, it's scratching. It's, that old art form that I started in back in 97. So I've been scratching for 20 years. So that's like, especially with world music, it's not as common as well. So that's something I'm still developing and still sharing as I play out more. But I don't let it overtake the music. I do it in smaller pieces, and gradually over the years I'm trying to find bigger pieces for it, because people do get do get a lot of enjoyment, I guess maybe nostalgia from that piece. But overall, I'm very hesitant to let it distract from the music, from the, produced songs themselves. And then a lot of the songs just aren't, they're just in a different vibe. So it's kind of a sporadic thing. In production, flute has been one of those things that, like I said, has been a little bit of a theme. And on some tracks I'll play. Some tracks I'll work with my friend Avi, or I'll play something simple myself. But I think the X factor really is always the juxtaposition. It's the things that people have quite not brought together that same way, And I think that's what's been fun about some of the remix albums, is having all these different artists reinterpret the genres in different ways, So I guess along with that is diversity. And again, it's like, it's much easier to get booked and to get your sound out there when it's just very predictable, but it's very boring as an artist. And I'm always being very diverse, trying to be very diverse in what I'm creating. And so I think that's one of the things that can give, a certain album its uniqueness.
Absolutely. And I would call it style, right? Like you've discussed the approach of like even snowboarding. Like I went snowboarding with a surfer, and you could just tell through his form that he was a surfer, but he was on a snowboard and he was riding it like a wave. Definitely tangent there. But there's a style behind the feel of the art. When you are cultivating that style, or the sonic textures of that you are creating and putting into each and every song, what goes through your head when you're thinking about like laying the bed for other things to work on, or sonically designing a sound?
A lot of times it's this balance between masculine and feminine, or acoustic and electronic, and usually one's informing the other. So if I start working on a track and the basis is a bit more acoustic, then the next part is seeing like, ooh, how can I have just the right amount? Or if it's really like softer, how can I have just the right amount of edge or grit or more obviously synthetic sound to be that complement, right? And it really relies on Ayurvedic principles. When I was going through my healing journey, I studied Ayurvedic medicine full-time for a couple of years. I had to quit DJing and quit my job and everything just to focus on health. And Ayurveda is all about opposites or medicine, and creating the perfect balanced meal through all these different tastes, through 6 tastes, or feeling what element, what quality you have a lot of. Like say if you're feeling really dry skin, dry throat, then you bring in the opposite quality. You bring in the oily quality, the unctuous quality. So similarly, that's kind of always inspiring the next step in a song. It's like, what does it have now? And what would be its juxtaposition? What would be its complement? And then kind of focusing on that. So if I have something that's a bit more of an electronic lead, like more of a gritty bass line, it's like, ooh, what can I add that's really soft over this? It's kind of like that. There's a song, Sparkle Adeline, that I did with Tone Ranger, who plays steel lap guitar. And there was just such a beauty to his guitar that it needed to have like kind of a gritty bass line to it, So it's just always that desire to balance opposites.
So there's one more song I'd love to get into, and I'm glad that you brought up the one with Tone Ranger, because that one is definitely has a place in my heart as well. La Vibra Que Sana, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, La Vibra Que Sana.
This song has a very different feel. I'm curious what was behind this one. How did you start it? What was the approach?
You know, it's funny, Alex. So this is a song with Alex Serra, who's one of my most favorite vocalists on the planet. He's from Barcelona. We met when I was playing a festival in Spain like 3 or 4 years ago. We met actually the day his first album came out. And then years later, that album's huge. And he's got a really big following. The production on that album is such a beautiful, minimal, dubby kind of soul vibe. So this is one of those situations where I'd known for a while, for a couple of years, that I wanted to collaborate with Alex. And so the sound of that song was really influenced by that artist's direction. I wanted to make a song that really fit his aesthetic, but went kind of in a new direction, in a direction that had my spin on it. That kind of almost triplet sounding guitar was one of the foundational pieces, but it was definitely listening to a lot of more minimal soul stuff like Rye and Rye X, and these kind of it's been a real big inspiration lately just to come back to more of a simplicity and just a much simpler, more minimal beat. It's actually ironic because the first beat I sent to him, it must have taken him like 8 months or something to get back to me with some vocals, but I was very patient because I was so grateful to work with him. What he sent me back, the vocals were so dope that I completely rewrote like 70% of the beat, because I'm like, that thing where you want to push yourself to make something that's really beautiful, and that matches the level of the beauty of this human. So it went through a lot of iterations to get to what you're now hearing. But it's funny because that also has that kind of big departure, right? These bridges that go into this like deeper, darker kind of bass sound, which I think is really especially interesting because this artist I haven't typically heard something quite like that with this artist's vocals. So that piece was exciting. But again, it was that like pushing myself to make it more of a journey, and have it be that not just a normal singer-songwriter song, right?
Yeah, but you have to be malleable enough to incorporate his style and his unique talent, but at the same time you want to blend your style on top of his style, so there's something new that's formed out of that, as you mentioned. So the second half, I totally agree, is a new depth, I feel, and then you slow it down with those words and really fade out the track in a unique smooth way. So when you're thinking through the energy of a track, how do you layer in and layer out things? How do you think that through?
It's interesting. I'm typically not using volume per se, like to come in and out, but I am usually creating space in order. One of the hardest things when you're trying to have a departure, one of the hardest things is how that very different part can go back into another part and not sound like random, not sound like you just changed the channel and went to a different song. And a lot of times the way that I figured out is to create like a bar of space, to have space so those instruments aren't butting up against each other. And so you can hear that on like so many of the tracks that I work on, is that there's the drums kick out, or the bass kick, the drums and the bass kick out, or there's even sometimes there's even like it goes beyond the normal 8-bar measure into like a whole bar of, you know, something really simple playing, and then the next part comes in, and that's definitely utilized on that song in order to get those parts to fit together. Like they don't fit together if the instruments butt up against each other. But I think one of the really sweet things with that is there is a bit more traditional high energy to the chorus, and the energy of the chorus is even higher because we've gone even so much lower into this more darker minimal piece. And so that's something that I try to do, and it's not always successful. And I was happy that it was somewhat successful in that song, but to see how far we could push it into the depths, and then how bright and light and kind of sweet, like jazz chords, you know, we could be in the chorus. So it was like a challenge. It's like always setting myself up. It's like, why can't I just do simple shit? You know, like, why can't I just, you know, same formula, whatever, but it's not every song. It's like, I'm pushing myself to like get weird or just, yeah.
Yeah, I like that kind of a hack, I'll put it, or a trick, you could say, of adding the extra bar after the 16 or something, just to give you a little bit of extra space and then push everything out one bar, just giving a little extra transition time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. There's a remix that I just did for Mo's, one of his most famous tracks, Om Ganesha. I just remixed that for him, and it's been getting a lot of plays, and it's been really sweet. And that's a similar, where there's a big bridge, a big departure, and then a hi-hat. It's like the departure coming back into the chorus again just didn't work, and it has to be like a whole bar of just a hi-hat clicking, and then it comes in, and it's like, oh God, thank God for that technique. There's no other way I could think to like bring them back together, but it works. So
yeah, well, that's great. I think about like a wall, or like a line of buildings, and they're all different heights, you know, and you gotta, you know, put the roofs eventually to line up. Anyways, maybe bad analogy. Stacking layers of
no, that's
audio.
original. That's an original analogy.
I'm curious if you have a favorite book, quote, or message that has most impacted your life.
There's a book written by my spiritual teacher, Amarananda Bhairavan. He wrote a book on Kali called Kali Zodia. That's especially when I was going through some really tough healing years, it was such a big boon. It was almost like superhero, you know, coming into your powers, kind of superhero level, you know, spiritual powers. And a lot of those books, also Martine Prechtal, Secrets of the Talking Jaguar, similarly, like those really inspirational kind of spiritual superpower kind of books. Those have been really influential. But I think the philosophy overall is the simplicity of the present moment. And that's something that I'm always striving for, and throughout my day coming back to body-mind connection. And even in production, wishing to have more moments of being less in the suffering of my mind, and more connected, the mind connected to the simplicity of the body, the simplicity of the breath. And the philosophy of that is this style called Brima bodywork. It's a bodywork, it's a self bodywork, and it's just like a life philosophy to become more present. And that's probably the most influential philosophy in my daily life.
Tell me about a turning point in your career. And you may have already touched on it if you want to go in depth about your healing journey, or maybe there's something else that you'd like to share. You know, fork in the road, and you chose a path, or was chosen for you. So any way you want to take that, but how'd you get to where you are today, and what was a major fork?
I'm glad you asked that. There's definitely some props to be given to, I had a local friend, David, who happens to have his own very successful music career as the Polish ambassador. And when I was working on my first album, I just happened to meet him around that time, and I didn't even share it with him until it was pretty much wrapped up, and he was excited to release it on his label, which had kind of been newly formed into a proper record label. And that was definitely a turning point, being able to tour and open for him and to be able to connect with his fan base. This was back when social media had a lot more outreach, where he could make a post and people would actually see it without having to, pay for it. It's pretty funny. You can see the people, like who did well before 2016, and the people who have a lot less following post 2016. It's like the people who were on those platforms earliest really got the biggest boost, and he was one of them for sure. So that was definitely a turning point, having, getting to tour with like Ayla Nerio and, the Jumpsuit, Saki and Isaac Chambers and Ryan Herr and the whole Jumpsuit crew. That was a really big thing. And just to have that community, just to have that foundation of other professionals, other musicians, it's still to this day, Jumpsuit doesn't really exist in the same way, and those artists aren't connected in the same way. But those foundations it laid for collaboration and for musical community is huge. Like, to have homies, to have like loved ones, to have people that you look up to, that are peers who you just love, who you love as people, who you want to listen to their music, because they're your favorite. That was kind of sowing the seeds of that. And especially like in Colorado, I feel like there's definitely a lot of people who found my music through that avenue.
Yeah, well, I think it's so important to collaborate for anybody out there. And you've obviously collaborated with lots of different artists, but the reason why I think it's so powerful is not only it brings two different sets of backgrounds and ideas to the table, but you're also blending your like fan base. So each other's artists and fans are learning about you, and ultimately, it's just helping spread the word. So what in your mind makes a great collaboration? So just thinking back, you could choose any song in your head if you want to talk about it specifically, or just generally, what makes a great collaboration?
What makes a great collaboration? Well, there's two parts. One is working with another artist who they have to be inspired. They have to be really into the track, or they're not really going to do that much with it. They're going to put in like a little time. They need to be inspired, and then they need to want to like see a vision of it being on another level, like hearing where it is now and hearing where it could go. And that's really not that common. A lot of times remixes are easier collaborations in that way, because there's not as much back and forth. Just take it where your vision, wants to go. But again, you have to be really inspired. It's been really amazing to work with Moses material and be working on these like this whole EP of remixes of his stuff, because everything he's done is so beautiful. And I think part of that inspiration is seeing really obviously where it could go, and if there's kind of a set, like in that style, it's very four to the floor, really steady. And it's like, oh, right away, take that out, put in the boom bap. Already there's just like such a change happening that it's a very obvious direction for me. But usually I think that's the thing, is like similarly to composing a track and having that contrast and having those like highs and lows and trying to push those out and expand that to have even more of a journey. Similarly, with a collaboration, it gets really exciting when the other artist has a completely different skill set, and you can really, play within this bigger gamut. Like we all have our individual skills and directions, but then when we include another person in the mix who can go here and here and here, and you love and appreciate that in them, then it's really exciting to bridge that and have that whole new skill set, have that whole new perspective in the mix.
So after Jumpsuit, your music started to evolve, and after putting out some of those early tracks, I noticed that it has grown with you, I would say. And how, in your mind, has your journey changed over the course of releasing music, and where do you anticipate things moving forward?
That is an amazing question, because it's definitely something I think about off and on. The overarching, like when I started, there was a lot more of like dark bass music going on in the scene, and I was like, I want to feel like happy. I want to feel good. I want to feel the energy of the drums. That was my direction, right? And that first album, especially that first and second albums, All the Wild Creatures and One Under the Sun, those were definitely in that direction. But then what happened is internally I started to feel more of my lower body, more of wanting to be in my hara, like in my belly, in kind of like the water and earth centers. And again, that like Ayurvedic philosophy of that like grounding energy. And also it's kind of like it's a more sensual vibe. And that's where everything has been going towards, and hasn't really stopped. I'm still a sucker for, that balance between up tempo and down tempo tunes, but I want everything to feel sensual, feel a little bit more pleasurable in the body. But I wonder a lot of times if I'm losing homies, like if I'm losing fans, because there is such, I don't know, it feels like there is such a difference between the music I'm making now and what I started with. And sometimes I think of going back, like starting like, I'll start with like the drums from Peacock Drop and create a whole new track around that, just to dip back into that flavor and see where it wants to go. But I definitely feel like there's certain people who are like hardcore into the old stuff, and that's pretty much what they listen to. And at most sets, I don't even play anything from my first albums, because just because the directions just changed for me internally, and also my own experience on the dance floor has changed the music I make. Like the last 9 years of being a dancer in ecstatic dance, that really informs. I hear a certain song, a certain beat, and I'm like, I love how this makes me feel. I'm going to make something in that direction.
I like that approach, and incorporating your experience of what you've learned just from observing and playing your music out to the crowd, because obviously that experience is one direction. But I think, of course, your fans of the old tracks will still be there. They still got the old tracks. The old tracks aren't changing, so that people can always loop back to that. But I appreciate artists' evolution and listening through different albums and seeing some of the changes, and but to get to understand behind some of those changes why the sonic changes are there, that's interesting. So I appreciate you sharing that. What advice would you give to a young musician starting out today?
I would say either have some basic understanding of piano or guitar, and have those be your foundational kind of production instruments, like as producer. And I'm assuming you mean like a starting producer, especially just having a basic understanding of piano and music theory. I would recommend, there's a book called Hook Theory that completely changed my life as far as like trying to have normal piano lessons, which don't really teach you how to produce music, to learning like oh, you don't need any specific notes. You just need to know that there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's these numbers, and you can apply those numbers to any key. And these are the relationships between the numbers. It's just like, so I would say, look through Hook Theory. It's kind of interactive ebook thing, super easy, super easy way to learn music theory. And then the other thing is, I would say, look at what aspects of the music that you get most excited about. You know, if it's a certain sound, if there's a certain song where there's a certain break, and start to pull that apart, start to see what makes that, you know, such a vibe for you individually. I think that's a really good start. And I would say thirdly, to just start. There's a certain amount of creative block that I see that happens with a lot of people, especially with like learning Ableton or learning, you know, a digital workstation. And it's just like, you don't need all these things. You don't need the keyboard. You hardly need anything these days. You need a laptop, go on to YouTube, do the work, do an hour or 30 minutes of like intro tutorial and just get started and get addicted. It's like once you get started and you get past the learning curve just a little so that you can start messing around, it's like a video game, but it's a video game that actually feeds your soul and feeds the people around you, and you can get lost into it on a daily basis. But the big thing is you have to start. You have to just start making some weird random shit and have fun.
Absolutely. That starting is so crucial. So I'm curious, thinking back to your early days when you first started with Ableton, and what were some of those mental breakthroughs or ahas, like, oh, I didn't realize that I could do this, or this is how that's done?
That's music theory. It's really funny. There's all sorts of plugins and hacks and tricks and tips for Ableton, but nothing can overcome the fact that if you don't understand the concept of key and the concept of how the notes fit in the key and some basic associations, then you know, no matter what you do, you're still going to be so limited, you know. So yeah, it goes back to like that like little step with Hook Theory. I was like running samples through Mixed in Key to see what key they were, because I didn't even know how to like find the key within Ableton. And then I was like putting samples. This is, you know, before my first album. And then I was just like trying to use samples, you know, as my structure. And it's so limiting when you can't really write your own bass lines, when you can't really write your own chord progression, you know? So I would say, again, it's just that basic music theory.
That's great. But it's important to try and make do with whatever you have, and what you had and in your back pocket were a bunch of samples. So you tried to, you know, scrape it together.
Yeah,
I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that there's a limit, right? Based on that sample.
Yeah, it was still fun. I mean, it was still obviously addictive and fun. And my first EPs and songs before Jumpsuit were just such an exploration, you know, just figuring out like, oh, what is this? How do you do this? Whoa, that sounds cool. Like, I don't know why it sounds cool. And then, you know.
So for people listening who don't already know you, what are the best links and platforms that they can connect with you and reach out?
Yeah, for Spotify users, Spotify is my biggest listenership. And so all my discography's there. For the remixes though, which I have a lot of like bootleg unofficial remixes, especially 90s hip hop, which is like one of my favorite genres growing up. That would be Bandcamp. If you put in Scott Knight's Bandcamp, that will plug you into some like, you know, Brazilian Beastie Boys samba vibes, or Cuban Tribe Called Quest vibes, or, you know, Seal Gone, you know, reggaeton, you know, like all these mashup remixes that I've done. So that's a really sweet. And then I would shout out the YouTube too, because like La Vibra Que Sana. They have a full animated music video that is probably the art piece that I'm most proud of. In this incarnation, it was like almost a year of planning and work. And so there's some really sweet music videos that I'm really proud of that are in the YouTube channels. So again, it's Scott Nice on YouTube.
That's great. And tell me about that music video a little bit. Were you designing it? Were you like the director and doing everything from start to finish?
So I was like, Pinteresting, on a Pinterest board with different styles that I liked, and then created a whole art storyboard where it's like, okay, this frame, I cut out some pictures of Alex because that's featuring Alex. I cut some pictures out from his other music videos. So I had like him standing straight, him standing sideways, and I would piece together these worlds of color and simple geometry around, a couple basic movements like walking sideways, walking towards me. So I had the basic direction of what he would need to be doing. And then, I just had these scenes in my head that I storyboarded out. I was actually in Hawaii, so the time difference between Barcelona was even gnarlier. So it was like 10 a.m. in Barcelona, and Alex is at over the green screen. It's like 2 a.m. in Maui, and I'm out like on this cold lanai up on the mountain. And in the middle of the night, just they're streaming, and I'm directing and asking him to do things. And so that was a whole crazy adventure to film, overseas for a couple hours. And to be like really hoping that I had the shots that I needed to fulfill the vision, and it all came together. But the actual animation and After Effects is so time consuming. I must have spent like 8 hours one day, like clipping out my hand frame by frame so that I could drink this ocean that I was swimming in. Anyways, so. Yeah, it was something that I probably won't go back into do anytime soon, because I probably could have produced the whole album in the time that it took me to animate that video. But I get a lot of enjoyment out of
great.
Creating cool shit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bet you have a new appreciation for other music videos that you've seen. Yeah.
Don't animate them, just film them and then save a couple hundred hours.
Good advice. Well, some of the AI stuff coming out, man, I don't know. It may be very fast to animate in the future. Do some weird stuff.
Yeah, true. True.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you breaking down in depth like your creative process from start and thinking about the balance and adding all your layers, and then like removing them, muting them to make sure that each part kind of has its own ground to stand on, and then building things. So I really appreciate all the time that you spent sharing all your creative process. So thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Listening to the Freio Music Podcast with Michael Morahan. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to share this podcast everywhere. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay tuned.